is looking to fundamentally restructure the international trading system. And just yesterday, he announced a pause on what is called a global set of reciprocal tariffs for all countries but China.
With a single move, Canada has thrown the entire electric vehicle supply chain into disarray, catching Tesla off guard and casting a shadow over America's clean energy ambitions. A major shift just occurred in North America's trade dynamics, and most people didn't see it coming. Canada, known for its quiet diplomacy, has taken an uncharacteristically bold step that's already shaking its long-standing trade relationship with the US. The country announced a pause on reciprocal global tariffs, excluding China, and introduced a new set of targeted trade policies aimed squarely at reshaping the North American auto industry. For decades, the US and Canada have operated under the assumption that, despite occasional disagreements, their trade relationship was fundamentally solid. The two nations share the world's longest undefended border and are deeply intertwined economically, especially in manufacturing and transportation sectors. That long-held assumption has just been challenged in a big way. Canada's latest move serves as a wake-up call, potentially signaling a much broader shift. At the heart of it is a new set of tariffs and export restrictions on critical raw materials, nickel, lithium, and aluminum, vital to the production of electric vehicle batteries and modern automotive manufacturing. These materials aren't just commodities, they're the backbone of the EV revolution. Tesla, a key player in that space, has relied heavily on a steady and affordable flow of these resources from Canada. Now, that supply chain has been disrupted, and the effects were immediate. Tesla's gigafactories in Nevada and Texas, essential for large-scale battery production and vehicle assembly, didn't come to a halt overnight, but the shockwaves were felt right away. Suppliers warned of price hikes. Logistics teams scrambled to secure alternative sources. Investors grew nervous. Tesla's stock began to wobble as the reality set in. A carefully built and efficient supply chain had just been undermined by Canada's new trade direction. While the US has had numerous trade disputes in recent years, these have mostly involved rivals or geopolitical tensions, China being the most prominent example. What makes this different is that it's happening between close allies. Canada's move isn't retaliatory or defensive. It's a calculated strategic choice based on its own economic interests and a desire to secure a stronger position in the emerging clean energy economy. The timing is critical. Battery production is already one of the most volatile and expensive parts of making electric vehicles. Unlike traditional auto parts, batteries require very specific materials that are hard to substitute. If prices rise or supply becomes unpredictable, automakers are faced with two tough options: raise vehicle prices or absorb the cost, cutting into already thin profit margins. Neither is a good solution, especially in a fiercely competitive global market where customers expect affordability and innovation. This isn't just Tesla's problem. The entire American EV strategy, which aims to cut carbon emissions and reduce reliance on fossil fuels, depends heavily on stable, affordable access to materials that often come from abroad. Canada, notably, is one of the US's top suppliers of lithium and nickel, two essential ingredients in battery chemistry. That makes Canada's policy change more than a business issue. It's a potential roadblock to achieving national climate goals. From Canada's perspective, however, this isn't an act of aggression, it's a strategic recalibration. By leveraging its position as a major provider of critical materials, Canada is making it clear it wants a bigger piece of the clean energy pie. For years, Canada has invested in green technologies, but most of the manufacturing, jobs, and consumer brand value has been concentrated in the US. Now, Canadian policymakers are signaling that they want more of the supply chain, more factories, more jobs, more value within their own borders. And with global demand for electric vehicles continuing to rise, they see this as the right moment to push for that shift. For Tesla and Elon Musk, the timing couldn't be worse. The company is already grappling with rising interest rates, fierce competition from legacy automakers, and ongoing regulatory challenges. These new tariffs add another layer of complexity, especially since Tesla hasn't diversified its supply chain as much as some of its competitors. Musk has long emphasized vertical integration, controlling everything from mining to manufacturing. But in reality, Tesla still depends heavily on international suppliers for many core materials. Canada's move may force Tesla to rethink that strategy entirely. The company might have to invest heavily in Canadian infrastructure or form new partnerships within Canada just to secure future access to vital materials. That's no small pivot. It would require billions in investment, operational restructuring, and likely delays in production. But this goes far beyond one company. Canada's decision to use its natural resources as leverage in trade negotiations reflects a larger global trend. Countries are waking up to a new kind of economic power in the era of clean energy, control over raw materials. If the 20th century was shaped by oil, the 21st will likely be defined by access to lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Countries that control vital natural resources, or their export, are beginning to hold a disproportionate amount of global influence. The challenge for the United States is that it hasn't built enough domestic capacity to shield itself from external supply shocks. Despite its potential, the US mining industry has suffered from decades of underinvestment. Opening new mines isn't easy. It takes years, often meets resistance from environmental groups, and is burdened by regulatory roadblocks. That makes it incredibly difficult to respond quickly to sudden changes in supply chains. This situation highlights a stark reality. America's clean energy goals are still heavily reliant on foreign resources, and as the recent developments with Canada demonstrate, even close allies are ready to take tough stances when it serves their national interests. It's not necessarily unfair. It's just a reminder of how tightly geopolitics and climate policy are becoming intertwined. It all started with what appeared to be a bold yet calculated move. Canada introduced new tariffs and export restrictions targeting key materials essential to electric vehicle (EV) production. While the headlines zeroed in on Tesla, this move wasn't about one company. It was about the structure of the entire North American auto supply chain. For years, automakers across the US, Canada, and Mexico operated under a deeply integrated system. Parts moved freely across borders, with vehicles often crossing between the US and Canada multiple times before final assembly. That seamless system is now under pressure, and the cracks are starting to show. One of the most visible signs of this shift is a recent proposal by Canada's New Democratic Party. A 100% tariff on Tesla vehicles entering the country, combined with a $10,000 subsidy for every electric vehicle built in Canada. In essence, it's a strategy to penalize the foreign leader in EVs while heavily rewarding domestic producers. It's a two-pronged approach aimed at boosting economic competitiveness while appealing to voters. At first glance, it looks like classic protectionism. But this is not the old-school kind driven purely by nationalism or fear of imports. This is something more calculated and nuanced. It's what some are calling green nationalism, a strategy that uses climate policy not just to cut emissions, but to realign economic priorities. Canada is using this moment to establish itself as a leader in the clean energy transition while strengthening its own industries. It's a message that resonates with the public. Fight climate change, support local jobs, and build a sustainable future at home. And the strategy is already showing results. Canadian operations for automakers like Ford and GM are receiving renewed interest, and Volkswagen is moving ahead with plans for a major battery plant in Ontario. The pattern is clear. Basing production in Canada now brings major advantages. Companies can tap into local subsidies and avoid the burden of new tariffs, giving Canadian plants an edge over their US counterparts as global automakers juggle costs and environmental targets. Ironically, some of this momentum stems from earlier US policy. During the Trump administration, electric vehicles were tied into broader strategies around climate and manufacturing. But over time, shifting priorities and trade tensions have complicated those efforts. Now, the dispute with Canada risks undermining parts of that original vision. If US automakers like Tesla, Ford, or GM can't keep costs low because of trade barriers and disrupted supply chains, then mass-market EVs become harder to produce affordably. And affordability is key. One of the biggest hurdles in EV adoption isn't range or charging infrastructure, it's price. If average consumers can't afford to make the switch from gas to electric, then the entire clean energy transition slows down. That means more emissions for longer and a delayed response to the climate crisis. The North American EV strategy was built on the idea of lowering costs by scaling production and integrating supply chains across borders. Now, with that model under threat, there's a real risk that adoption will stall. Meanwhile, Canada has shifted from being a supportive partner to wanting to lead the charge. And that ambition goes beyond just building more vehicles. It's about rewriting the rules. For decades, trade between the US and Canada was based on mutual benefit. Each country specialized in what it did best, and their interconnected industries thrived on efficiency. But Canada's recent actions suggest it's willing to move away from that model if it means capturing more of the economic value at home. Of course, this approach carries risks. The US could retaliate with its own trade measures, and some Canadian sectors might feel the heat. But Canada's leadership appears willing to take that risk, betting that long-term control over green industries is worth short-term friction. And with global demand for EVs rising each year, they might not be wrong. One of the clearest signs of how fragile the old system has become is just how much impact a single policy change can have. A modern car might cross the US-Canada border 5 or 6 times during its production. An engine might be built in Windsor, tested in Michigan, and returned across the border for final assembly. Aluminum frames from Quebec, dashboards from the US Midwest, wiring harnesses from Mexico. It's a complex choreography that relies on seamless trade. Now, that system is faltering. As soon as Canada implemented its new trade restrictions, major automakers began adjusting. Ford warned of production slowdowns. GM paused work at several plants. Suppliers began laying off workers. What was once a finely tuned machine is now under serious strain. And it's not just a temporary hiccup. It could mark the beginning of a new era in North American manufacturing. This is a structural issue. Many of these factories were built on the assumption of low-cost, tariff-free trade. Their profit margins are already narrow, so any increase in raw material costs or shipping delays can disrupt entire production schedules. The bigger concern is what lies ahead. If prices for raw materials continue to climb, if political tensions create more trade barriers, and if cross-border operations keep facing delays, some factories may no longer be viable. That could mean more than just temporary layoffs. It could lead to permanent shutdowns. Communities across Ontario, Ohio, and beyond that rely on these plants could see long-standing jobs disappear for good. This isn't just a story about production numbers or logistics. It's about what happens when a tightly connected economic system starts to break down. For decades, the North American auto industry was held up as a prime example of successful cross-border collaboration. It gave the entire region a competitive edge, allowing vehicles to be produced faster and more affordably than almost anywhere else in the world. Now, that system is under serious threat, and there's no simple solution. At the same time, Canada's new strategy is raising bigger questions about the direction of future economic policy. If environmental goals and domestic job protection are now being woven into trade decisions, other countries may start following this lead. We could be moving into a new era where trade agreements go beyond just tariffs and quotas and begin to include climate regulations, labor standards, and control over national supply chains. That marks a major departure from the globalization model most industries have grown accustomed to. What we're seeing unfold is a clear sign that globalization, as we knew it, is changing. Global supply chains that once stretched across continents are being reconsidered. Governments are now paying much closer attention to where their key materials come from and how much influence they really have over their own production lines. The global push toward clean energy and electric transportation is accelerating this change, and countries like Canada are choosing to act boldly. For the United States, this presents a significant challenge. If Canada's approach works, if it creates jobs, opens new factories, and strengthens its economy, then other allies may be inspired to take similar actions. That could lead to more tariffs, stricter export controls, and greater reliance on subsidies as tools of economic strategy. In this kind of environment, companies will need to be more adaptable than ever. It won't just be about building great products or having a strong brand. Success will also depend on where companies manufacture and how their supply chains are structured. When tariffs were first introduced under the Trump administration, the message was clear: bring jobs back home. The goal was to rebuild American industry and level the playing field for workers who had been left behind by decades of outsourcing and automation. For many struggling communities, that message brought hope. Tariffs were seen as a potential turning point, a chance to revive blue-collar work. For a time, it seemed to be working. Some factories reopened, and there was renewed optimism about reshoring manufacturing. But now, that vision is beginning to unravel. As trade tensions with Canada escalate, the very workers who were supposed to benefit are among those being hit the hardest. Plants already operating on thin margins are facing rising costs for materials like aluminum and steel. Cross-border logistics, which used to run smoothly, are now hampered by new tariffs and uncertainty in regulations. Production delays are becoming more frequent, forcing manufacturers into difficult decisions: cut back on shifts, lay off workers, or shut down operations entirely. General Motors has already scaled back output at several US plants due to higher input costs and supply issues. Ford has issued warnings that more job cuts could follow if trade disruptions persist. Stellantis, one of the world's biggest car makers, has said temporary plant closures are on the table. These aren't isolated cases. They're part of a larger pattern of strain in a system that once supported millions of middle-class jobs. The emotional impact of these job losses is impossible to ignore. In communities that were promised a new era of stability and opportunity, there's now a growing sense of disillusionment. Many of these workers have spent their lives building the backbone of America's industrial economy. Now, they're watching their paychecks shrink and their job security vanish, not because of low-cost competition overseas, but due to a trade dispute with a close ally. This is where the contradiction becomes stark. Tariffs were intended to protect American workers from foreign threats, but in this case, the policies are creating the very problems they were supposed to solve. The goal was to support domestic manufacturing, yet the added costs are now making it harder for that very industry to compete. Because the North American auto industry is so interconnected, damage to one part of the system ripples across the entire network. Even suppliers not directly hit by the tariffs are feeling the strain. When a major automaker slows or halts production, everyone down the line suffers. Smaller manufacturers that make parts or components suddenly find themselves without orders. Many of these businesses don't have the financial resources to withstand a sudden loss in demand. Some are reducing operations. Others are shutting down for good. And this isn't just affecting car manufacturing. The ripple effects are being felt in related industries: logistics, warehousing, repair services, and even local retail. When large factories scale back or close, local economies take a hit. With fewer people earning steady incomes, small businesses, like restaurants, shops, and service providers, start losing customers. It's a chain reaction that can destabilize entire communities. As this reality sinks in, the political consequences are becoming harder to ignore. Many of the areas hardest hit by the trade war are also key battlegrounds in US elections. In states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, blue-collar voters played a critical role in flipping seats and deciding presidential outcomes. Now, with job losses mounting and economic uncertainty deepening, frustration is growing. The excitement that once surrounded the America First message is beginning to wear off. Polls show that voters in traditionally conservative manufacturing regions are starting to question whether the trade policies are really delivering on their promises. Behind the scenes, strategists from both major parties are expressing growing concern. For Republicans, the risk is obvious. The very policies that once energized their base in 2016 and 2020 are now being linked to economic hardship. For Democrats, the challenge is different, but equally serious: how to offer a compelling alternative that addresses economic pain without repeating the same mistakes. Within the GOP itself, divisions are emerging. Some members, particularly those connected to the business community, are calling for a reevaluation of the trade approach. They warn that continued conflict with allies like Canada could damage the party's reputation on economic issues. Others, aligned with the populist wing, are digging in their heels. They argue that the current pain is temporary, a necessary sacrifice for long-term gain, and blame foreign governments or global corporations for the setbacks. But for families dealing with job losses, rising prices, and declining financial stability, political arguments don't change the reality. People are being asked to be patient, to wait for policies to bear fruit, but their bills are due now. The cost of living is rising. Vehicles are more expensive. Repairs take longer, and even used cars, once a reliable, affordable option, have surged in price. Maintenance has also become more burdensome. Car parts are harder to find and more costly than just a few years ago. A combination of semiconductor shortages, rising material costs, and shipping delays has turned what used to be routine car repairs into long waits and unexpected expenses. For families that rely on a single vehicle for work, school, or medical needs, these issues are more than just inconvenient, they're disruptive. In rural areas or smaller cities with limited public transportation, the impact is even more severe. For many, owning a vehicle isn't a luxury, it's essential. As prices rise and reliability drops, families are being forced into tough choices. Do they hang on to older cars that cost more to maintain? Take on debt for a replacement? Or cut back in other areas just to keep going? All of this adds to a growing sense of economic anxiety. And it's not just auto workers who feel it. Across multiple industries, Americans are under pressure. Wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Rent, groceries, and fuel are eating into paychecks. Meanwhile, interest rates are climbing, making borrowing more expensive and straining household budgets. For many families, it feels like no matter how hard they work, it's still not enough. What we're seeing may be the early stages of a broader global shift, one that could reshape how power, production, and influence are distributed around the world. As the US gets caught up in economic conflict and internal political division, other countries are quietly forging ahead, strengthening alliances and building their position in key sectors. One of the most critical of these sectors is electric vehicles. The biggest question now is whether the US can keep pace. For decades, the United States was seen as the anchor of the global economy. Its manufacturing might, trade agreements, and leadership helped shape international markets and policy. But in recent years, that image has started to fade. Political instability, shifting policy priorities, and a rise in nationalist sentiment have made even close allies rethink their long-term commitments to the US-Canada's recent trade decisions are just one example, but they're part of a broader trend. China, in particular, has seized the opportunity. While the US has grappled with internal rifts and strained partnerships, China has been steadily building new relationships, securing supply chains, and investing heavily in the industries of the future. One of its most strategic moves has been targeting Canadian companies involved in extracting and refining critical minerals: lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite. These minerals are the foundation of electric vehicle batteries, and whoever controls their supply holds a powerful advantage in the race to lead the green economy. Chinese firms are now approaching Canadian mining companies with offers of long-term contracts, infrastructure investments, and joint ventures. These aren't short-term deals. They're part of a deliberate, long-term strategy. China isn't just aiming to lead in electric vehicle production. It's positioning itself as the primary supplier of the materials that fuel the entire industry. And Canada, feeling undervalued or sidelined by the US, is becoming increasingly open to these new partnerships. This shift carries more than economic weight. It's also symbolic. For years, Canada was seen as the United States' most reliable economic partner. The two countries shared a tightly integrated supply chain, particularly in the automotive and energy sectors. But as trade tensions rise and the US leans further into protectionism, Canada is beginning to reconsider its role in the relationship. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canada is placing a stronger emphasis on economic sovereignty, independence in critical minerals, and building deeper ties with Europe and Asia. The result is a global landscape that looks very different from the post-World War II order the United States once helped shape. New trade agreements are being signed, many of them without American participation. Global companies that once looked to Michigan or Ohio for their next factory now turn to Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe. Developing nations are choosing partners who bring investment without the political strings, often favoring China or the European Union over Washington. This shift is visible across industries, from agriculture and semiconductors to heavy manufacturing. The change is especially apparent in the electric vehicle sector. South Korea's Hyundai and Kia have made significant strides in EV innovation, launching new models that have earned international acclaim. German giants like Volkswagen and BMW are fully embracing electrification, backed by steady government policy and carefully managed supply chains. Even emerging players like Vietnam are making inroads. VinFast, a Vietnamese EV company, is expanding into global markets, including the US. These companies aren't just succeeding on merit, they're benefiting from the unpredictability of the American approach. One of the biggest challenges facing US industry isn't a lack of innovation or talent, it's a lack of consistency. American trade policies shift dramatically between administrations. Subsidies are unpredictable, introduced, removed, or altered depending on the party in power. Immigration laws change frequently. For companies planning long-term investments, this creates an unstable business environment that's difficult to navigate. Take clean energy policy as an example. While the US offers federal subsidies for EVs and green infrastructure, the support often falls short or is distributed unevenly. Some incentives are tied to strict domestic manufacturing rules that exclude even close allies. Others are delayed by legal battles or face political pushback. The result is a fragmented and unreliable system, especially when compared to the clear and consistent frameworks found in other countries. Meanwhile, raw material costs in the US continue to rise, partly due to tariffs on imported metals and components. Labor shortages are worsening, driven by an aging population and lower immigration rates. And the country's polarized political climate makes it difficult to pass or maintain large-scale economic reforms. These issues are slowing what was once considered a world-leading effort toward electrification. This isn't just a temporary disruption, it's a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains. Companies are diversifying production, spreading risk, and reducing dependence on American markets and policies. The consequences are tangible: fewer jobs, fewer factories, and diminished influence for the US in some of the fastest growing industries of the future. In the past, the US could rely on its size and technological edge to lead, but in today's economy, that's no longer enough. Success now hinges on stable trade relationships, consistent policymaking, and long-term investments in infrastructure and workforce development. Without those foundations, even the most innovative US companies risk falling behind. And the long-term concern is serious. As countries like China, Germany, and South Korea consolidate their hold on the EV market, the US risks not only struggling to compete, but being sidelined altogether in shaping the future of global transportation. That shift would carry enormous economic and geopolitical consequences. Dominance in green technology translates to influence in climate policy, energy markets, and even military logistics. It's a form of soft power that could rival oil in its strategic importance. If the US wants to remain a major player, it must rethink its strategy. That includes rebuilding trust with allies like Canada, offering clearer, more reliable policies, and reinvesting in domestic capabilities that have weakened over time. Global leadership is no longer just about having the biggest economy. It's about being the most dependable. There's still time for the US to adjust course. The nation has the talent, financial strength, and industrial legacy needed to reassert its leadership. But it will take sustained focus and long-term vision, qualities that have often been lacking in recent years. Without that commitment, the world will continue moving forward, and the US may find itself left behind in industries it once dominated. The signs of change are already visible in regions like Ontario, Bavaria, and Seoul. But the real transformation is happening behind closed doors, in boardrooms, government meetings, and investment plans. As trade routes are redrawn and alliances reshaped, one thing is clear: the global economy is evolving. And the choices America makes now will determine whether it remains at the center of that evolution or becomes a bystander in a game it once led.